Who is the scariest person you've ever met? Story 1, I had a classmate in second grade who had no freaking emotions. His name was Carl, and he felt like an empty vessel. One day for show and tell, he brought in a cat skull and told the class it was his family's cat, Peter. It smelled terrible, and the teacher freaked out and sent him to the office. I did not see him for a few days. When he returned, he spent all day, every day, staring the teacher down. One day, he took his pen up to the desk and stabbed her in the leg. He was immediately expelled. I never thought I would see him again. Senior year in high school, we got a new kid, and it was Carl. He was back. He did not hang out with anyone and stayed by himself during lunch. This girl, Patty, that I was talking to, trying to hook up with, kept getting followed home by him every day, and he would wait outside her house across the street for hours, studying and taking pictures of her house. I started walking her home every day, and he would always be there. So one day I asked what his freaking problem was. He just said, "You," and walked away. That night he broke into Patty's house, but like a jerk did not think to check if anyone was home. So Patty's dad stopped him almost immediately and called the cops. They found a ton of strange substances and weapons on him and surgical equipment in his backpack. I never saw him again. Story 2. I had a neighbor. Some of you read about him in a previous post. He was abused physically, mentally, and possibly solely by his parents. He was a complete nightmare to live around. He had absolutely no sense of right and wrong and loved to hurt people, a real sadist. Not that he did not come by it through trauma. He was clearly tormented. That being said, you might call the better part of our friendship normal. We did normal things, watched movies, played football, played Sega Genesis. But sometimes you would just rub him the wrong way and he would snap. I told him his mom was really loud when she yelled one time, and he walked away like he was mad. I did not think much of it. I was walking back inside, and then all of a sudden I was on the ground bleeding all over the place. He threw a large rock at my head and busted it open. I had to go to the hospital for stitches. I told my mom it was an accident. He got stranger. He liked to talk me and his sister into doing inappropriate things while he would just watch. And if I tried to stop, he would tell me to keep going or threaten to hurt me. Keep in mind we were around 9 or 10. He shot birds, squirrels, and other animals with his air gun, kept the carcasses on his back porch, and I am pretty sure he messed around with them. The strangest thing I ever saw him do was when I was on my porch with him, and he asked if I wanted to see something cool. I said, sure. We walked across the street to a neighbor's house, and he jumped on the car hood and started kicking in the windshield. It would not break, so he went to the neighbor's back porch and found a garden tool and just destroyed this guy's car. The guy was not home, but a lot of people saw him do it. I ran the moment he came back with the garden tool. The cops came to his house. I guess the guy pressed charges. I think he was around 12 at the time, and he had to go through all kinds of legal trouble for it. They made him take the ride downtown and everything, and I remember so clearly looking out my window and seeing him going from his porch to the back of the cop car, just screaming his head off, saying, "My name is Drew and my life sucks," over and over, even in the cop car as they rolled down the street. The last time I saw him was at a party senior year. He was beyond wasted, and he was a few years out of high school. As stated in the last post about him, he ended his life a few years ago. Very sad kid, but very freaking scary as well. Story 3, the person I am living with. I work with her, and when I was about to be homeless, she said I could rent her spare bedroom. The first week I was there, she decided to tell me about how she is fascinated with people who kill and that she studied them heavily in college. I was 21 and she was 32. I did not know what to say, so I just said it sounds interesting. Then 2 months into me living there, me and her were both very drunk, and she told me she has always wanted to harm someone. She added that she daydreams about it regularly. When she told me that I said that I never want to upset her, she laughed and said she would not tell me that if she did not trust me completely. The next day I asked her if she remembered what we talked about, and she said the night was a complete blank. I am in a strange place in my life at the moment. Story 4. The scariest person is someone I do not even know. While I was back in college, I had the opportunity to fly out to Kansas City to see a friend for a weekend. We had not seen each other in a while, and I really needed a break, so I accepted the invitation. I arrived at around 9 p.m. I knew nothing about the city, and he did not have a car or cell phone because of how close his apartment was to campus. He walked to pick me up from the bus station where I got off from the airport. We went back to his apartment. We started the night off talking and drinking. It was fun. Time went on and it quickly became 3 a.m. We noticed the time just as there came a loud knock on the door. I asked my friend if someone just knocked on the door with a piece of metal. He said he thought so, but before he could finish his sentence, we suddenly heard a roaring loud voice from the door. A deep, guttural man shouting about free candy. He kept knocking and yelling for us to open the door and come out. My friend approached the peephole quietly and looked through. He turned around with the color draining from his face and mouthed the words that we were going to die. He slid down to the floor and crawled back to where I was hiding behind the couch. And together we made our way to the back of the apartment and hid in a closet. The knocking continued. I asked him what he had seen. He said the man must be at least 6.5 feet tall, that he was strong-looking, completely unclothed except for a head covering, and holding a double-barreled shotgun. His voice carried the emotion of someone half amazed and half horrified. We were frozen while waiting for the door to come down in splinters. The knocking got louder and louder, and we could feel the pounding in the floor where we were hiding. There was no phone to call for help, no car to escape to out of the window. We were on the 4th floor with no access to the stairwell and nowhere else to go. After about 15 minutes, the knocking stopped. We no longer heard anyone yelling about candy. We waited for another half hour before coming out and looking back into the hallway. He was gone. The next morning I went out and rented a car, and my friend went and bought a cell phone. We made a police report, but they never followed up on it. Story 5. I used to work in retail, and our store had the creepiest visitor. He was an old man in his 80s who needed a walker to get around. His nickname was Alien because he had a license plate hanging from his walker that said Alien. One night, right before we were about to close, an employee of mine asked him about his license plate. He told us he felt like an alien because he got criticized for harming the neighborhood cats. Without even being asked, he went into detail about how he trapped them in the hood of his truck, left the truck running, and then skinned them. We immediately asked him to leave and banned him from the store for also asking our female employees if they wanted to hang out when he was on enhancement pills. Needless to say, whenever my former co-workers see him in the mall, they avoid all eye contact and call security. He is a very unsettling man. Story 6. I was doing research in the rainforest of Madagascar on top of a mountain, living in tents with a group of absolutely intense scientists and students who were some of my best friends. I was studying insects, but we had primatologists, herpetologists, botanists, cultural anthropologists, and many other specialists there as well, not to mention about a dozen Malagasy technicians and guides. The site was so remote it was about 20 kilometers from the nearest paved road and took us about 12 hours on foot to reach it due to the mountainous terrain. I remember one day in camp, a pair of guys showed up we had never met before. They were very muscular, which was not too uncommon for Malagasy farmers, and wore faded basketball jerseys. They wore hats, which I thought was odd, and they also carried huge blades. Naturally, we were all a bit taken aback since we had no way of defending ourselves, and we had been in the country for months with no incidents of violence or intimidation. Normally, when a Malagasy person meets you, they shake your hand, smile, and say, "Salama." Not following that ritual in the countryside is considered an insult. They walked right into camp with no smiles, no handshakes, and complete silence. They sat at our table, stared at my research leader, and started talking with no build-up at all. We had one of our technicians translate for us since our Malagasy was weak. These men called themselves Zama, which means black magic guardians, and claimed they had black magic powers. Apparently, they were crime fighters protecting the local villages in the valley from bandits. They claimed they could transport themselves anywhere within 2 minutes and that they were impervious to bullets. The first Zama then said that if we did not pay him 600,000 Ariari, about $300, a tremendous amount of money for that region, we would be attacked by bandits and they would not save us. We figured it was a shakedown meant to prey on locals who believed in regional religious practices, including black magic. Or more practically, people feared that the Zama and the bandits were working together, collecting protection money from poor farmers. Our research leader knew he could not afford that money, so he instead offered them unlimited free hot meals, which he could write off on his grants. And amazingly, they accepted, provided we gave them some headlamps and a pair of rain boots each. They showed up a few days later, proudly wearing their gifts and smiling. They ate a massive amount of rice, gave us a bottle of homemade alcohol from the leader of their village, and went on their way. Story 7. I was at a concert, and this guy was standing nearby. I was a bit drunk and turned to talk to a friend and bumped his backpack. He glared at me, so I put my hand up and said something like, "Sorry, bud, backpack attacked me." Fast forward a bit and a couple more drinks, and someone bumped me into him again while dancing during the music. He turned around and glared again. I said, "Hey man, you are in the front row at a rock show wearing a backpack. People are going to bump you. You have to deal with it." He looked me right in the eye, slapped my shoulder, and gave a little friendly shake, then said, "Do not worry about it." So I said, "Cool, cheers, man," a bit sarcastically. He turned around, but a guy with him turned pale and looked at me for a moment before turning back too. 20 minutes later, my friend who was playing came over and told me I should stay away from that guy because he was one of the biggest illegal substance dealers in the area, and he was not averse to or inexperienced in extreme violence and ending lives. He said he thought the guy was going to stab me when he turned around. I steered clear but brushed it off since I do not live in an extremely dangerous area, so the biggest fish in a small pond still feels small. That changed when I looked up his extensive and brutal criminal record online and saw news stories naming him as an arrested party. I was very glad to be alive. I saw him at another concert a few weeks later, and he gave me a nod. I nodded back and drank very little that night. Story 8. I was in the psychiatric ward and they brought in a new patient in restraints and locked us all in one of the rooms in the unit. We could get out, but no one could get in without a key. One of the other patients sneaked a look at his file, and he was a violent patient there because he was threatening to harm people. Most people with serious mental illness I met were great people, and even most of the ones there for dangerous thoughts were upset by those thoughts and did not want to act on them. We heard lots of yelling and banging, and at one point when we were watching from the windows of a side room, he ran into the main room, followed by a bunch of staff, and started throwing around all the tables. He eventually calmed down to the point where they let him walk around, and while I was terrified at first, once I saw him up close, the fear vanished. He was a large, muscular, middle-aged man, but he was also nearly crying because he thought there were bugs crawling all over him and he could not get them off. He actually seemed very scared. He was only there a few days before they decided that having him there was not worth the risk and inconvenience it posed to the other patients, because every time he would panic, we would have to sit in one of the locked rooms for a while. In between his episodes, he would talk to me and dance to 80s music. He liked the other patients. It was the staff he had issues with. And he even taught me how to play blackjack one evening. Once he accidentally walked in on me in the bathroom, since there were no locks on the bathroom doors, and he was so embarrassed I thought he was going to cry as he apologized over and over. At first, that was the most scared I had ever been of a person, but he made me see people with violent mental illness in a different light. It would be really tough to have a family member with that kind of struggle. He definitely did not need to be out in public with those tendencies, but I do not think he was a bad person, just very sick. Story 9. I was walking a bike trail with my dog, and it got dark. It was next to a river and heavily wooded. I was walking back to my car, and at that point it was completely dark and hard to see, which I was fine with because I like the woods at night. As I was walking, I noticed a man step out of the trees next to me just as I passed, and he started walking behind me with his hood up. He just appeared when I walked by like he had been waiting for me to pass so he could come out and walk behind me back to my car. I had my dog with me, and he was not happy with this unknown presence behind us, so he kept turning around and barking at the man. I was trying not to have an encounter, so I kept pulling my dog's leash. I then realized I was not going to be scared and felt confident about defending myself if I had to. At one point, the man just stopped dead in his tracks behind me. I turned around, and he was just standing there in the middle of the trail. He was still standing there even when I got far enough down the path that when I looked back, he was just a speck. The creepiest thing was seeing him from a distance, just standing in the middle of the trail. Story 10. One summer I worked at a camp in a very isolated area. One of the people who worked at the camp, I think in maintenance, was a loner type who at some point developed an interest in me. I was about 19 and he had to be at least 40. I thought he was harmless at first and he would hang around me a bit and try to chat. I figured it was normal coworker interaction until one night he invited me to have a drink with him. Another older coworker pulled me aside and warned me not to let myself be alone with the maintenance guy. I figured he meant that the maintenance guy was planning to make a move on me, and I was too embarrassed to ask for details, so I just decided to take his advice and keep my distance. I was not rude, but I stopped chatting with him like before. Soon after, the maintenance guy came by my cabin late one night. I was sitting in the dark outside just enjoying the evening when I saw him come out of the woods. He could not see me in the dark, but my cabin's porch light was on, so I could see him. I watched him slowly and silently circle around my cabin, peering into all the cracks and spaces between the boards and around the edges of the window coverings. It was bizarre because he had always seemed friendly before, but that night I saw him in a different light. He looked dead serious, trying to make no noise, and had this intense look on his face that gave me chills. It did not look like the first time he had done that. I said something like, "Hey there, are you looking for me?" He jumped and instantly dropped the creepy look and switched back into the friendly version of himself I had seen all summer. He said he had been following a deer he thought he saw in the woods and quickly left. I remember being extremely unsettled because I felt like I had caught the real him. What he was like when he thought no one was watching, and it did not look good. After that, I moved to a cabin closer to other people and stayed far away from that man. I found out years later that not long after that incident, he harmed a girl to death in those woods. Story 11. A couple of months after my mother passed away, I was placed in a teen psychiatric ward because I was suicidal. Within about 12 hours of being admitted, I realized my life was not so bad and I needed to toughen up. However, I was in there with some severely disturbed teenagers. That was frightening on its own, especially when we had to be locked in our rooms at night for safety. One evening, I was sitting in the dining room with a girl I thought was nice. I knew she had schizophrenia and experienced both auditory and visual hallucinations, but she seemed fairly normal. We were chatting when suddenly her eyes went completely dark, changing from bright blue to almost black. Then she began slamming her head onto the table. I froze, unsure what to do. She lifted her head, looked straight at me and said, "There are angels and demons around all of us. They watch us. They watch us." Then she grabbed my wrist, shaking my arm while saying in a strange voice, "Your angel is Laura. Your demon has no name. He bites me. Make him stop." Then she started hitting her head against the table again. By that time, the nurses and aides rushed in and took her to the padded room to calm down. My mother's name was Laura. She had died just a few months earlier. I was terrified of that girl after that. The day I was released, she slipped me a note. It only said one word, Laura. It was absolutely chilling. Story 12. Maybe not exactly terrifying, but definitely disturbing. In high school, there was a teacher well known among us as being inappropriate toward pretty girls. One day, while teaching about bacteria, he finished his main presentation and brought up another slideshow with just 5 slides. Every slide showed graphic medical images. Students were shocked, and he told us to grow up. A few months later, he offered an extra credit opportunity to a few randomly chosen girls. The details are unimportant, but it involved water, and they would need to change clothes afterward. The classroom had a large storage closet where he had placed towels for them to follow inside to change. During the experiment, one girl called another over to help, and they discovered a hidden camera, angled in front of a mirror he had positioned in the closet. They saw enough of the recording to know it perfectly captured them changing. No one called the police for several days, and when they finally did, his hard drive was wiped clean, and he even passed a lie detector test. It was especially disturbing because earlier that year, he had taught one of his classes how to cheat a lie detector test, and he was close friends with the local police. It still makes me sick thinking about how many years he got away with such disgusting behavior. Story 13. There was an old cafe customer we nicknamed Lurch. He was in his mid-30s, tall and skinny, with long, messy, heavy metal hair, ripped jeans, a leather jacket, and a dirty t-shirt. He had no tattoos or anything visibly strange, yet he was the most unsettling person I have ever met. I have been attacked and spit on by a homeless man before, and he did not scare me nearly as much as this guy. Lurch would come in every day for a cup of coffee and just sit there staring at our 16-year-old female barista. Any question directed at him was met with a glare, a grunt, or a muttered phrase like, "Someone should teach you a lesson." That last comment was said to me after I confronted him about his behavior. On the surface, he looked like just another burnout from the 80s, but the energy he gave off was something else entirely. I have worked in customer service for years and lived in rough neighborhoods. I have met gang members and even people who had killed, and some of them I actually liked. This man, though, made my skin crawl. He had the deadest black eyes I have ever seen. When you feel safer around a confessed murderer than around someone like him, that says everything. Our manager refused to ban him, so we took precautions. One of us would always walk our youngest coworker to her car. Many nights we would find him parked in his old Dodge Dart with mismatched paint, just sitting there in the parking lot watching. We pooled money to buy a taser for the shop and even talked about getting a gun. Finally, one of my coworkers told her boyfriend, and he and his cousins confronted Lurch outside. After that, we never saw him again, and for that, I am grateful. Story 14. When I was a missionary in Brazil, my companion and I were approached by a man who greeted us in near-perfect English. He said his name was Bickford and that he was an American who had been living in Brazil for about 30 years. He looked homeless, with a huge beard and wild hair. At first, he pretended to be interested in our message and asked for a copy of the Book of Mormon, but it was clear he mostly wanted to talk to Americans. We met him a few times, always in public but quiet areas. During one of our weekly reports, we mentioned him to the local church leaders. Their reaction was immediate. They told us to stay away from him. Apparently, he had a history of strange and dangerous behavior and often harassed missionaries. My companion and I couldn't believe they were talking about the same man, so we kept meeting with him. Every time we saw him, though, something about him felt off. He would lie constantly, his stories made no sense, and there was a strange darkness about him. One night, after talking about his house deep in the jungle, he invited us to meet him by the road near his home so he could guide us there. We agreed. When he finally arrived, he led us down a long, overgrown path through thick jungle. I kept walking into spider webs and fighting panic. When we reached his house, my blood ran cold. It was a half-collapsed wooden cabin, filthy and filled with trash. There was no electricity or running water. He welcomed us inside, and when I shone my small flashlight around, I saw writing. Chalk notes covering every inch of the walls, even the ceiling. Each message was frantic, messy, and horrifying. Some read, "Jesus will forgive me, but I have to stop." Others said, "I did it again," followed by dates and names of children with graphic, disturbing descriptions. My companion and I tried to stay calm, asking harmless questions to distract him, while we both realized we were in serious danger. We made an excuse to leave, saying it was late. He offered to walk us out, but then insisted he knew a shortcut, leading deeper into the jungle. We refused politely and followed our original path back as fast as we could. When we reached the road, we finally breathed again. Later, we told our leaders, and they moved us to another area within a week. Before leaving, we left a warning in the area record book for future missionaries to avoid Bickford. I still remember how it felt. Pure, overwhelming fear, the kind that makes you physically unable to speak. Story 15. There are people I have been physically afraid of, and people I have been emotionally afraid of, but the most unsettling person I have ever met is currently 12 years old. He is a kid I used to teach at my martial arts school before he quit about a year ago. He is small and pale and weighed 64 pounds at age 11, but I am almost certain he is a developing psychopath. He is very intelligent and extremely skilled at lying. What makes it even more disturbing is that you can see him actively learning how to become a better manipulator. Like he has not yet grasped that he should hide some of his deceit. For example, one time some of us were standing around before demo team practice. He was walking past an older teen, around 18 years old, who was practicing with training weapons. As he walked by, he turned to the older kid and said, "You hit me." The older kid said, "No, I did not. I would have felt it." He replied, "Oh yeah, and it is hard to explain," but you could see in his eyes that he was carefully filing that information away to improve his lying skills. He would lie about things that did not matter at all, seemingly just for practice. As instructors, we started piecing together his more troubling manipulations and lies. The things he did showed that he did not view other people as having feelings, and that he saw himself as superior. What makes it even more frightening is that the other kids his age, and even some older students and adults who did not know him well, absolutely loved him. He was by far the most popular student among the kids at the school. It is hard to know what to do in a situation like that. I guess since he is gone now, he is no longer my problem. Story. 16, I am from a small farming town, and in the second grade, a new kid named Brady moved in. Because we were seated in alphabetical order, I had to sit next to him. I noticed immediately that something was off about him. He was a pathological liar, and not just about little things, but about everything. He and I both went to morning care before school, and in the third grade, he suddenly stopped coming and switched classes, and he was also given an assigned seat on the school bus we both rode. When I was a teenager, I mentioned to my dad that I always wondered why Brady had been removed from morning care that year, and I finally found out the reason. It turned out he had snuck up behind me and choked me until I passed out, and I had blocked out the entire incident. He also once took a stapler and a pack of staples from school, sat behind me on the bus, and tried to force staples into my head. Luckily, he was very small for his age and not strong enough to do much, and I had thick hair tied up, which helped protect me. In high school, he continued lying and moved on to dealing illegal substances. I am 25 now and have no idea what he is doing, but I think I would still feel a chill of panic if I ever saw him again. Story 17. In my rural neighborhood, there were two brothers. One was my older sister's age, and the other was about 4 years older than me. I will call him John. John was a sociopath. All the kids younger than him were scared of him. He was pale and had a piercing, menacing stare. One day, as he was getting off the school bus, he smashed my head into the bus wall, knocking me out for a moment. I was around 10 years old. John was sent to juvenile detention for that, so no one saw him for a few years. When he returned to public school, he was still in high school, and I was in junior high. He no longer rode my bus route, so I could avoid him. He was back at school for only about half a semester when word spread one morning that he had attacked another little kid on his bus. Moments after the first bell rang, police officers arrived, and most of us saw John being escorted to the office. As the story went, he was searched for a weapon, and an empty needle was found in his boot with a little blood on it. He had stabbed an 8-year-old in the neck with the needle just for the thrill of it. He was arrested and sent back to juvenile detention, this time until he turned 18. I saw him just once more in my life. I was driving deliveries for my summer job, and he had moved in with relatives in the town where I worked. He was skateboarding, still pale, with a scruffy growing beard. When I played games later in life, I always imagined a grown-up John as someone like a chaotic character, wild and dangerous. Story 18. I was clerking for the Constitutional Appellate Court of Uganda when I came face to face with a woman who had taken the life of her own 10-year-old child. The facts of the case were some of the most horrifying I had ever encountered. She was a mentally ill mother with several young children. One day when her 10-year-old son skipped school, she tied him to a tree after finding out. She then stuffed his clothes with banana leaves. These leaves are highly flammable. She piled more leaves around him and then set them on fire. She stood there and watched her child burn. The boy's uncle happened to arrive then and ran to free him, trying to put out the flames, but the mother began beating the uncle and pushing the child back into the burning pile. By the time the uncle managed to free him and put out the fire, the boy was so badly burned that he died before any medical help could reach him. I saw her in court in her prison uniform, hair messy, eyes wide and bloodshot. This was years after the incident. She stood during the hearing as the judges recited the facts of her son's death. I cannot say exactly what was going through her mind, but I saw something like satisfaction on her face, mixed with a deep rage. as if she would lash out again if her hands were not restrained. She showed no reaction when the court upheld her death sentence. I remember leaving the courtroom feeling sick and shaken. Story 19. I am a woman and was around 21 or 22 at the time, short and pretty petite. I was eating lunch with my boss and her 12-year-old daughter on an empty restaurant patio. The restaurant was closed, so we had just sat there with our food. The area was part of a quiet downtown, with most businesses closed for the day. My boss walked over to a store nearby to get drinks for us. A man at least 6 feet tall and close to 300 pounds, drenched in sweat, walked past us, stopped, then turned back. I barely noticed him until he approached and said, "Excuse me, were you two girls just talking about me? Did you say something about me when I walked by?" I said no, we definitely had not. He said, "Good, because I would not want to get violent." That is when I realized he was likely a paranoid schizophrenic experiencing hallucinations. He eventually walked away, but kept turning back to glare at us. He could have easily overpowered us, and his anger felt dangerously close to erupting. We called the police afterward, and they told us he was a known problem in the area, often arrested but released hours later. It is chilling to think about people like that, lost in their own world of fear and aggression. I still think about him sometimes and wonder whether he ever received real help or if he is still out there, terrifying strangers in passing moments. Story 20. I once assisted a lawyer in a capital murder case. The client, Bertram, was in a county jail awaiting a trial that would likely never happen. He was schizophrenic. I accompanied our punishment mitigation expert, someone skilled in assessing mental capacity and future dangerousness in capital cases, to visit Bertram. He was considered too dangerous for standard visitation, so we had to meet him in his cell. We were escorted by a correctional officer named Tiny, who was around 6'6" and about 400 pounds. Tiny had been the one to deliver Bertram's meals, and just a week earlier, while inside the cell, Tiny had looked away for only a moment. Despite being only about 5'2" and extremely thin, Bertram had leapt onto Tiny and caused shocking damage in mere seconds. Tiny did not seem angry about it. Everyone in town had always known Bertram was unstable, and that something terrible would eventually happen. Bertram had recently returned to town after 6 months in a state mental hospital. He was discharged simply because they needed the bed space. Everyone understood he should not have been released, but long-term care was not budgeted for. His family had given up on him completely. Only his grandmother took pity on him, allowing him to live in a decaying barn a short distance from her house. He was not allowed into the house or even onto the porch after dark. One night, while his grandmother was up late baking for a church event, Bertram came inside to ask for cigarette money. She reminded him of the rules and said he would have to wait until morning. Bertram picked up a bread knife and killed her, then took $5 from her purse, went to the store, bought cigarettes, and returned to the barn. The store clerk saw his blood-soaked clothes and called the sheriff. When the sheriff arrived, he found the grandmother's body under a table covered in baked goods. Bertram was later found calmly smoking in the barn. Tiny led us to his cell. Bertram looked like a wild, feral creature. Tiny told him we were from his lawyer's office and needed to speak with him. At the cue, Bertram immediately knelt, facing the back wall, with his legs crossed behind him and hands interlocked. Tiny told us that if Bertram chose to attack, that position would delay him by a second, and that was our only advantage. Jerry, our expert, entered the cell first, and I followed with a camera. Deputies stood at the doorway, ready to intervene. Jerry asked Bertram questions, trying to assess him. Bertram responded with hostility, saying he did not want us there. Jerry remained calm and continued gently. Bertram kept warning us to leave if we did not want to get hurt. Eventually, in a moment that stunned me, he walked to the back wall, knelt, and assumed the position again. He was clearly fighting the urge to attack. We left then, without incident. Bertram is now in a mental hospital, awaiting competency to stand trial. It is unlikely that day will ever come. The charge remains capital murder because he took the cigarette money after killing his grandmother. Story 21. My ex-girlfriend and her entire family were the most disturbing people I have ever dealt with. The warning signs started a few months into the relationship when she began creating arguments out of nowhere. Then I met her parents, who were just as volatile. Her father was a large man and an obsessive hunter. He had an entire room filled with weapons. Owning weapons was not the problem. It was his unstable behavior that made it frightening. One day after an argument between me and my ex, she threw herself on the floor and started screaming. Her father charged up the stairs and got right in my face. He punched me hard in the stomach, knocking me back. I got up and ran for the door. He chased me, and I barely made it outside. I could not drive yet, and I had no phone, so I just ran toward my home, which was about 3 miles away. My ex was behind us, screaming and cursing. Her father eventually stopped chasing on foot to get his truck. I ducked into the woods and kept moving toward home, hiding whenever I heard a vehicle. I could hear them shouting my name as they searched. I had never been so terrified. After hours of running, I made it home, only to see their truck already there waiting. I jumped the back fence and got inside the house, telling my parents everything. I yelled out the window that if they did not leave, I would call the police. Eventually they left, and I filed a restraining order against her father. I am grateful I moved out of that town. Story 22. A friend of my father's stands out as one of the scariest people I have ever encountered. My family used to associate with some rough individuals, and over time I distanced myself from that circle. This man in particular was deeply unsettling. On multiple occasions, we would be in a vehicle that got pulled over by the police. Before the car even stopped, he would leap out at full speed, crash onto the pavement, get up, and run. Once, when we were in my father's truck, a group of teenagers cut us off in traffic. At the next light, this man got out, walked toward their car, and the passenger, seeing him approach, rolled up the window and leaned away. This man punched straight through the closed car window and knocked the passenger out cold. I have heard him casually talk about chasing people down with baseball bats and beating them into unconsciousness. He once said he collected unpaid debts by gouging people's eyes with his thumbs, and I believed him. He even escaped from a major prison in Michigan once. He had been put on a work release program for good behavior and fled the moment he had a chance. It took authorities nearly a year to capture him again. Story 23. I went with a friend to a corner store. As I got out of my car, an older woman sitting in a beat-up truck called me over. She looked to be around 50 and was in the passenger seat. I started to walk toward her, but something felt wrong. I stopped about 8 feet away and saw there was a man in the driver's seat. She asked for directions to the interstate. The on-ramp was less than a mile straight down the road, so I told her clearly. She asked me to come closer. I said it was easy, just straight down the road. But she kept saying, "Come here, honey. I'm not going to bite. We just need directions." The directions could not have been simpler, yet she insisted I step closer. I took one step while pointing down the road, and she suddenly tried to grab my arm. I jerked back. She then asked me to get in the truck to help them. She reached again, and I saw the man in the driver's seat lift a hand from under some newspaper. He was holding a handgun. She was still trying to latch on to me. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, and they sped out of the parking lot. I do not want to think about what would have happened if I had stepped closer. Story 24. One of my housemates once let a strange girl into our apartment during my senior year of college. I lived in an on-campus apartment with 5 others. This girl showed up asking if our housemate Matt was home. Thinking she knew him, my housemate let her in. She went into one of the bedrooms and started rambling about strange things. She claimed she had been driving for 24 hours from San Francisco, that she was married to someone she had not seen since first grade, that she had just finished high school, and that she was studying neuroscience. Every statement contradicted the last. She loudly demanded to see random people none of us knew. My housemates David and Jason stayed near her, so she would not become violent. She kept pacing and acting erratically. She hit on David, tried to touch him, and even flashed herself. David was visibly uncomfortable and did not want any part of this. Her mood swung wildly from cheerful to sobbing about her parents. She refused to leave and wandered through the apartment like she was looking for something. We finally called the police because we were afraid she would become unstable. When 3 officers arrived, she told them she had substances and a knife in her bag. She did not threaten anyone directly, but she was clearly under the influence and not in control. They took her away. She looked pale, thin, wearing baggy clothes, and her head was completely shaved. As she was escorted out, she looked at us and slowly said, "Bye, guys," in a dazed voice. I felt a strange mix of pity and fear. On one hand, her life clearly had spiraled. On the other, it felt like she could have snapped and hurt any of us without warning. Story 25. A couple of years ago, I attended adult education classes and met some very strange and unstable people. I had no idea when I signed up that it was the lowest level program offered, which attracted people with criminal records and rough backgrounds. I ended up there mostly because I was lazy when choosing a school and picked the first one on the list. Many of the students had been in trouble for minor substance offenses, and a few had done very serious things. Most of them, however, were not frightening. Once you got past their intimidating appearance, many were surprisingly kind. They were people who had rough childhoods and were trying to move on. But there was one guy my friends and I called the anti-Messiah. He did not look dangerous at all. No tattoos, no scars, clean cut, just an average-looking man. That was what made him so unsettling. You expected normalcy from him, but the moment you spoke to him, everything changed. He never blinked. He would stare straight through you, and everyone who interacted with him described the same feeling, a creeping sickness, like something dreadful was about to happen. He had an uncanny ability to dissect conversations and expose hidden meanings in people's words. He would do it instantly, often humiliating or angering the person he spoke to. If anyone tried to argue with him, he would just stare silently, emotionless, like they were part of some experiment he was conducting. He talked about reality as if it were meaningless, saying everything you love is just in your imagination, that death is the final end, and after that there is nothing but eternal void. He spoke about these things at a very high level, constantly. He managed to break down even the happiest people, drawing them into depression, yet he always made it seem like life was the problem, not him. I eventually left that school, but that man still remains in my mind. He changed the way I look at people, and not in a good way. Story 26. My next-door neighbor growing up absolutely terrified me. His house was a decaying wooden shack with no glass in the windows, just garbage bags taped over them in the winter, except for a few stained glass windows on one side. He was a suspect in a well-known kidnapping and murder of a young girl in my town in the early 1990s, but he had a questionable alibi and was never convicted. There is even a book about the case that mentions him. When I was a kid playing outside, he would stand silently at his window and watch, waiting for a ball to roll into his yard so he could keep it. He would call the police on my parents, claiming we were throwing loud parties even though we never had any. When I was a baby crying in the backyard, my mom came outside to find him at the fence mocking me, yelling, "Wah!" like a grown man mocking an infant. According to the book, he would stand naked at his window so the girl across the street would see him. My dad said he could hear him late at night blasting adult films and shouting along with them. When my parents moved into our house, they found writing under the wallpaper in my room that said, "Forget him," over and over. The previous family had moved out because of him. He was a disturbing, sight-long, greasy hair, cowboy boots, and dead cold eyes. I used to lie awake at night, convinced he was going to break into our house. Even now, just thinking about him makes my skin crawl. Story 27. I had an elderly neighbor in high school who terrified me more than anyone else ever has. One night, after throwing a party while my parents were out of town, everyone had left except my girlfriend. The house was a mess, and we were waiting for a friend to bring food. I was cleaning in the kitchen, and my girlfriend was in the living room watching TV. She casually asked, "Why isn't Martin coming inside?" I assumed he was still outside texting or grabbing something. I peeked around the corner toward the front door and froze. My neighbor's face was pressed against the glass, staring inside with a dark, unreadable expression. My heart nearly stopped. My girlfriend saw my face and instantly knew something was wrong. She slowly turned to look and saw him too. He did not move. He just stood there, face against the glass, like something out of a nightmare. I had my phone in my hand with the emergency number typed in, waiting. I could barely breathe. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly turned away, not moving his head, just twisting his body, and walked off the porch. I crawled to a window to watch. He walked strangely, not stumbling, but with an eerie, slow pattern, his head tilted down. That's when I noticed blood running down his arm. I called emergency services immediately. As I described what was happening, he wandered between the cars in the driveway, still moving slowly, never looking back. Eventually, he walked down the street toward his house and vanished into his dark open garage. The police arrived minutes later. I told them everything, still shaking. I never told my parents because I had thrown a party and had my girlfriend over. I still think about his face at the glass. Story 28. In grade 6, a new kid joined our small school after being kicked out of his previous one. He lived down the same road as the school, but far off, near the other side of town. At first, he seemed like a decent kid. You could talk to him, and he seemed normal enough, but over time it became clear something was very wrong. Looking back now, I can only imagine what must have happened in his home life to shape him the way he was. One afternoon, I left class later than usual and saw him coming out of detention. He called me over and proudly showed me a large bottle of rose wine he had stolen from his father. He had been drinking it all day. Then he casually showed me the knives he carried in his backpack. He wasn't trying to scare me. He genuinely seemed to think sharing these things was a way to connect. In class, he would peel the labels off batteries, then later take them apart and use a bent paper clip to dig into the acid and press it into his arms just to feel the burn. His arms were covered in tiny burns and scabs. It was disturbing to watch. The thing that finally got him removed was when he found an old barbecue on the curb before school one morning. He smashed it apart to get the igniter piece, a small spark mechanism with sharp ends. At school, he jabbed it into his own skin and clicked it to shock himself over and over. Then he started doing it to other kids, jabbing them and shocking them throughout the day. The teachers found out, and that was the last day he was there. I saw him briefly the next year in junior high. He was smoking in the bathrooms and burning the walls with lighters. I do not know where he ended up. He was genuinely kind at times, but clearly broken by things far beyond his control. Story 29. When I was around 6 or 7, my parents took me to watch my older brother Darren play a football match at a large park. The first thing I noticed was the playground, which had a big zip line that immediately caught my attention. While the game was going on, my parents noticed that I had zero interest in the match and told my other brother, Colum, to take me to the shop nearby to buy sweets. I was even more excited when I saw that the shop was close to the playground. As soon as we got close, I ran straight toward the zip line and told my brother to get me anything from the shop because I didn't care what it was and that I would be at the playground when he got back. He had only been gone for about 30 seconds when I noticed a man entering the playground. He looked far too old to be there alone, had no children with him, and was walking quickly straight toward me with a glassy expression in his eyes. I nervously said hello, but he did not respond or slow down. I quickly went to the top of the zipline platform, ready to ride it and run if he got too close. He was about 10 seconds away from the steps when my brother called my name. I immediately climbed down and hurried toward the exit, keeping my head down and giving the man a wide berth. As we walked away, my brother said that the man looked suspicious, so he had stayed close. We went and got sweets, but I never got to ride the zip line. I still sometimes wonder what that man had intended. Story 30. The scariest person I know is actually my best friend. I always felt indebted to her because she helped me through a difficult phase in my life, so I tended to overlook her flaws. That changed one night when she told me she hated her fiancé so much that she had plotted his death. She admitted that more than once, she sent him to pick up food from a nearby restaurant located on a busy highway, hoping he would be hit by a car again, like he had been once before, and that this time it would be fatal. She told me it would be easier for him to die than for her to break up with him because, in her words, that way everyone would feel sorry for me. They would say, "Oh, poor you, your boyfriend died. I'm so sorry." And I could just fake some tears and people would comfort me. Hearing her say that chilled me more than any violent outburst ever could. I told her I could not support her staying in that relationship and that I wanted no part in any of it. I tried to rationalize that maybe she was just desperate and speaking out of frustration, but I have never looked at her the same way since. There is something far more disturbing about someone who calmly plots out another person's death with such cold logic than someone who acts out of sudden rage. Story 31. My neighbor terrified me. We both lived on the ground floor of the same apartment building, and 10 years earlier he had been a social, normal guy. But over the last decade he changed. He was a single man in his mid-40s who disappeared for a while, and then one hot summer night I stepped out on my porch for some air, and leaning by the wooden fence, I caught a glimpse of a shadow. I looked closer and jumped back as fast as I could. There he was in nothing but shorts, staring at me without blinking. My heart raced and I tried to play it cool, calmly saying hello and asking how he was. But he continued to stare, and I got so nervous I started muttering to myself. After 30 to 60 seconds, I very slowly went back inside, trying to act casual while practically thinking, please do not hurt me tonight. I had not seen him since 2 to 3 years ago, but almost every night since then, there has been a loud thudding sound coming from the wall between his living room and mine. My friends and I have speculated endlessly about what that sound could be. I hoped he was not digging a hole to hide something. I called the police more than once. His yard was overgrown, his windows blocked with stuff, and he never answered when officers knocked, so they could not legally enter without cause. How he gets food is a mystery. He has no known family or friends. Story 32. My ex used to pick hours-long fights with me twice a week like clockwork. If she did not have a new issue to raise, she would drag up an old fight and start it all over. Not to resolve anything, but to prolong the agony by repeating herself for hours. Once she hit me so hard I saw stars and my eardrum burst. She would break into my home to continue fights and refuse to leave. After she pulled a knife on me and then turned it on herself when I again asked her to go, she begged for forgiveness. I told her fights should not last for hours and that she needed to respect my request to leave my home. A few weeks later, she woke me by screaming in my face, and when I asked her to leave, she kept getting louder. So I slapped her and shoved her out of the house, grabbing her arm hard. The next day, she went to the hospital saying I had beaten her up and had the bruise recorded as evidence. She forced me to beg for forgiveness in public for 2 hours. She became a tyrant in the relationship, and every argument ended with threats that she would have me jailed and ruin my life. I eventually broke up with her, moved far away, and told her not to contact me. She texted me 200 times and called 100 times, even contacting my friends and family while crying and claiming I would not speak to her. I refused her apologies and am grateful I am not in jail. Story 33. I worked at a homeless shelter that had a strict zero-tolerance policy for sewer predators, but our screening process was limited to simply asking if someone had ever been convicted of a sewer crime. One night, a man I will call Reed checked in. He spent his time rambling about gold mining and trying to flirt with staff. Nearly all of us were women except for one male staff member. At first, his comments were mildly inappropriate, things like, "You girls are so beautiful if I were a younger man." But his remarks escalated quickly into things like, "If you keep smiling at me like that, they'll have to arrest me to keep me off you." We confronted him firmly, and he promised to stop. A few days later, a young boy staying at the shelter reported that Reed had grabbed him inappropriately. We immediately told Reed to leave and not return. He agreed but managed to charm a woman staying with us into leaving with him. We tried to convince her to stay, but she insisted that Reed made her feel safe. Less than 2 days later, I got a call from her. She was crying, telling me Reed was forcing her into sexual acts, that she was bleeding and did not know why, and that he was keeping her isolated in a room with no contact allowed. She had managed to call me when he stepped away. We contacted a domestic violence shelter immediately. I have no doubt that Reed was a true predator. Second story. A few months ago, I started talking to a guy I will call Joe. He seemed intelligent and funny, and we had a lot in common. One night, he sent me explicit messages. I was unsure how to respond because I did not know if I was interested in him that way. The next day we talked, and he apologized after I told him to slow down. He asked to hang out that night, but I said I was busy and suggested the next day instead. He spent the next few hours texting nonstop, trying to guilt me into seeing him. Around 1 in the morning, he called saying he was having a panic attack. Worried, I rushed to meet him, only to find him calm. He immediately shifted the conversation to whether I wanted to be in a relationship with him. I realized he had manipulated me into coming. After I made it clear I only wanted friendship, I went home. The next day he called repeatedly. When I finally answered, he sounded irritated that I was busy. I realized then that he did not care about me as a person, he wanted control. I blocked his number that day and never heard from him again. Story 34. I was charged with a minor offense when I was 13. Both of my parents and I were dealing with serious health issues at the time. My dad, who was still working, needed a liver transplant, but he was the healthiest of the three of us. My parents had to travel several hours daily for medical appointments, so I was missing too much school. I went to live with my grandmother for a few months, but when she got tired of caring for me, I was placed with a kind woman in her 50s. She didn't act her age and was welcoming. I stayed with her for a full school year so I could attend counseling for anxiety and have someone to talk to. There was another person living there at first, but he moved out. He had serious issues of his own. Later, I was told a new housemate was coming. He was 17 and had just been released from jail for stool abuse and assault. I was genuinely afraid of him. He didn't do much besides sit quietly, but I was on edge around him. Over time, I got to know him and discovered he was actually a kind and funny person. 5 years have passed, and we still keep in contact. He got his life together, reconnected with his family, found steady work, and got his own place. I had been afraid of him at first, but he turned out to be one of the few people who made a positive change. Story 35. My ex-boyfriend, a complete sociopath I will call Bill, became the most terrifying person I have ever known. I broke up with him after catching him cheating and kicked him out. The next day, he created a website dedicated to me and posted screenshots of old emails between me and a former boyfriend, emails written long before I even met Bill. He must have hacked my account to get them. He then emailed the link to every mutual friend we had, and even to people I did not know. Soon after, my friends and I realized he must have bugged my house. He had worked as a studio engineer because he would post cryptic updates on social media, referencing private conversation that only someone inside my home could have heard. If I watched a movie with someone or spoke on the phone, he would post something referencing what I said. I had to start making phone calls outside in my driveway. I finally got a restraining order. When the police served him, he began posting direct messages to me on his website. One day he would call me evil, and the next he would write that he loved me and ask why I made him do things like this. The domestic violence officer monitoring the case said his emotional swings were extreme and deeply concerning. But because he lived in another jurisdiction and had not physically harmed me, there was little they could do. Everything he wrote was technically protected speech. For 6 months I lived in constant fear, always watching my back and afraid to speak freely in my own home. Story 36. My husband's friend Brock had a younger brother named Bryce who always seemed a little off. Like many younger brothers, he copied everything his older brother did and tagged along everywhere, even when he was clearly not wanted. What set him apart was his rage. The smallest slight could send him into a violent fury. When my husband and his group of friends went camping during high school, Bryce forced himself along. No one was thrilled, but they tolerated him. During the trip, another local kid wandering the woods asked if he could join them. He was friendly, and the group said yes, everyone except Bryce. Bryce resented him immediately, even though he himself was also just tagging along. Throughout the evening, Bryce snapped at everything the new kid said. At one point, Bryce made a joke that did not land, and the kid jokingly made a sad slide whistle sound. Bryce grabbed a small axe from his gear and chased him around the campsite until the others restrained him. Later, Bryce got revenge by daring the kid to jump onto a slick log in the middle of a creek. He pressured him relentlessly until the kid did it and broke his wrist, forcing him to go home. Once it got dark and most of the group were in their sleeping bags, Bryce said he wanted to tell a scary story. Everyone was busy chatting and ignored him. After trying several times, Bryce silently pulled an air canister, the kind used to clean keyboards, from his bag and tossed it into the campfire. Just seconds before it exploded, one of the guys noticed, and by then Bryce had already disappeared into the woods. They all bolted as the canister detonated. When they returned, shards of metal were embedded in the tents, the coolers, the trees, everywhere. If they had stayed put, someone could easily have been killed.